Following Duchamp's lead, process artists rejected what they called the ridiculous formalist notions of opticality and flatness, and following on the lead of minimalism, focused instead on the physicality of materials. By physicality, they meant how materials themselves determined their own forms because of their own physical nature, combined with, say, gravity. Robert Morris was the leader here. In an article he wrote for Artforum in April 1968, he even came up with his own name for this kind of work, what he called anti-form art, indicating that form changed, slumped, drooped, whatever it might be. And to illustrate the idea, he showed pictures of Claes Oldenburg's soft sculptures. These were sculptures, you'll remember, whose forms were ultimately determined by the soft fabric material they were made of, and by the way that gravity acted on that material. Morris himself created what he called scatter pieces, like this one from 1968-69. He used soft felt on the floor, like Joseph Beuys, along with other materials like metal and even mirrors. Pieces were cut to standardized sizes to suggest an initial order, a little like in minimalism, but their appearance had nothing to do with universal mathematical absolutes. Instead, how they looked was determined by the more immediate and present factors, their own materials, and the force of gravity. Some pieces flop down on each other or on themselves. Other pieces are distorted by how they happen to butt up against a wall. Others stay just the way they came, because they are metal. Also, Morris put the parts on the floor without any predetermined arrangement. He certainly didn't begin with any mathematical sequences the way minimalists like Donald Judd did. And of course he didn't do what earlier artists had done. He didn't compose an artwork by arranging parts in any kind of aesthetic or coherent overall relation to each other, the way, say, Monet would do in a painting. Instead, parts are arranged according to chance. Each time the artwork would be installed, it would look different. So the look of the artwork was determined, ultimately, by forces beyond the artist's control. Who, ultimately, was the pioneer of this kind of art? In the post-war period, before Oldenburg, we can point to Morris Louis, and, even more dramatically, to Jackson Pollock. Robert Morris himself credited both Louis and Pollock for having, quote, used directly the physical, fluid properties of paint, unquote. In their work, you see the liquid qualities of paint, together with the effects of gravity and, of course, the way that chance affects how the paint would spatter, drip, and pool. Pollock is especially relevant here because he worked on the floor too. And before Pollock, there was the Great One, the artist who already, in 1913-14, had experimented with the way gravity and chance affected the look of string, Marcel Duchamp, in his piece 3 Standard Stoppages. Richard Serra's commitment to process art is maybe best introduced by looking at his own verb list compilation, Actions to Relate to Oneself, which he wrote in 1967-68. It's a kind of summary of his early work. For an important exhibition in Leo Castelli's warehouse in December 1968, Serra made splashing. He made it by throwing molten lead into a corner between the floor and the wall. Here, the connection to Pollock is pretty obvious, even down to the mechanical rhythm he used to splash it. That mechanical rhythm is like a minimalist sequence. He explored this idea of sequence in a short film, Hand Catching Lead, from 1971. Here, pieces of lead fall. Each time, Serra reacts by squeezing his hand to catch it. Because he's only reacting to external stimuli. Because he's not trying to beat the clock or anticipate the drop. He usually doesn't catch it, because his reflexes, being a kind of organic mechanism, only work so fast. In other words, the film reduces the artist, or it shows how the artist is reduced, to a material object that reproduces a mathematical sequence, the same kind of sequence of a machine. Occasionally, Serra does catch it, but then he drops it right away too, because catching it is a mechanical act, not the expression of any personal desire. He doesn't want it. He simply catches it because that's what his hand is there to do. No personal desire here, just the body as a machine. Process and sequence join in another of Serra's works, Casting, from 1969. Like in Splashing, Serra threw lead at the wall. Then he dragged away the lead slab to make room to make another one, and another, and another, until he didn't have room to make any more. So the piece shows all the issues of materiality, gravity and chance, in the particular parts that he made, each one of them irregular, but it also shows the math sequences of minimalism, here determined by how far out the original piece was pulled from the wall, and where the wall is. Serra's corner prop from 1969 incorporates a block of lead and suspends it in a corner. What holds it there are all material things: the shape of the corner buttressing it in, the gravity pushing it down, the strength of the lead pole holding it up. It's lead, so it's a tiny bit shiny, reflecting the world and reminding us that it gets its meaning from the outside. Also, lead gets scratches and discolorations based on what's happened to it in the world. Lead, by the way, is also a liquid, a very, very slow liquid. If you could watch over thousands of years, you would actually see corner prop change in front of your eyes, slumping, drooping, and puddling. In fact, when Serra started with his lead, he used a pure form, and it often collapsed. Then he started having lead with antimony mixed in to make it stiffer. In these early years, he had no interest in working with steel, because that was way too sculptural. It was way too arty, a material associated with artists like Picasso and Julio Gonzalez. Here's one last Serra, called One-Ton Prop, House of Cards, from 1969. It's made of 4 500-pound slabs of lead, with antimony mixed in. At a glance, it looks like a cube, an ideal form that has to be the same everywhere in the universe and for all time, because it's the expression of an idea, of a kind of formula. But, unlike Tony Smith's die, Serra's sculpture is no cube. Instead of having 6 sides, this one only has 4. And they don't stand at right angles. Instead, like in a house of cards, the stiffness of the metal, together with gravity, are the only things that hold it together. That's all there is to it. There's no inner meaning beyond that. For that reason, it's clearly empty inside, an idea Serra took from minimalism. And as in minimalism, it also has a reflective surface that's been scratched and discolored, not by the artist to give it any sort of expressive meaning, but only by the world. In Los Angeles, Bruce Nauman explored similar themes in his studio, where he used his own body as the primary material of pieces he recorded on film. Walking in an exaggerated manner around the perimeter of a square from 1968 took personal will out of the equation. The square determined his movements. I'm particularly fond of Self-Portrait as a Fountain from 1966. Instead of being a film, it's just a still photograph. The whole idea derives from art history, from the Baroque, from fountains like Gian Lorenzo Bernini's Triton Fountain from 1642-43 in Rome. In other words, it was a cultural idea he simply found, the way that minimalists found mathematical ideas. I also like that his mouth isn't used for speaking, but is instead for spitting. It's reminiscent of the way the surrealist Georges Bataille redefined the mouth for eating. It even suggests spitting at us, and maybe at our ideas of art. Most of all, there's the title, including the word fountain. That's where Nauman reveals his greatest influence, from Duchamp, who had a big show in LA in 1963 that changed the way that Nauman thought about art. For the first time, by the late 1960s, as many women were becoming artists as men. Several women became process artists, and in a 1966 exhibition, the art historian Lucy Lippard, who was the curator, suggested calling what they did eccentric abstraction. Eva Hesse was one of these artists. In 1964-65, she saw art by Joseph Beuys in Germany, the country where she and her family had escaped persecution from the Nazis when she was a little girl. The way that Beuys used felt and wax, materials that don't hold their shape, set her on a path to making works like Ishtar from 1965. Like minimalism, it's got the repeated sequence of geometric shapes, circles. And like process art and Beuys, it has those strings hanging any which way. It has something more. The circles are like breasts, and the strings are like milk. Altogether, it suggests a superwoman, like the goddess Ishtar, the ancient Near Eastern goddess of love, fertility, and war, who was the inspiration for this Diana of Ephesus fountain, a Renaissance copy of an ancient Roman statue installed at the Villa d'Este at Tivoli, near Rome. So now, like Bruce Nauman a year later, Hesse brings an ancient cultural idea into her piece. Like math, she didn't invent it, she simply fused it with minimalism and with process art. Like Sarah, Hesse made her own version of a cube, too. This one is called Accession 2 from 1967. It's open on top, but not exactly empty. What you see are the ends of rubber loops she has basically sewn through the holes on these 4 metal grills that make the sides. On the outside, it has a uniform look, but on the inside it's all irregular. It looks funny inside. It even looks somehow absurd. Absurd how random it is, given the standardized appearance of the exterior. So it ends up looking frail, perishable, even insignificant. Vulnerable, maybe. This was the theme that came to dictate her work. Here's Untitled, wall piece, from 1970. It suggests 4 geometric shapes in a series, like minimalism. But look at those shapes. They're made out of cast fiberglass, a material that slumped when it dried after she removed it from its molds. Anyway, they are different sizes and shapes, and they're vaguely skin-colored, with latex-colored ropes that just flop down any which way. They look like an absurd lineup of pathetic creatures, the ropes like legs, or maybe like intestines. They look frail and sickly. The fact that they're partly made of latex, a material that decays when it's exposed to air, just emphasizes the point. In fact, many of Hesse's pieces don't exist anymore. They've fallen apart. This was a theme that would suit her in a sad way, because she herself died of a brain tumor at age 34 in 1970. Her last piece is Untitled, Rope Piece, from 1970, which studio assistants helped her to make. Covered with latex, the rope just hangs there, looking brutalized a little, like bodies from meat hooks, and quite dead. It's really pretty moving. Hesse was able to make process art into an emotional medium. This work also has some smart art historical references. The rope looks like lines drawn or maybe thrown in space. In other words, she's translated Pollock into sculpture. But let's not neglect Duchamp, who used string too, in his gallery installation of the first Papers of Surrealist exhibition that he curated in 1942. And rubber shower caps too, which he stretched for his Sculpture for Traveling from 1918. In paintings made on the floor, another artist, Linda Benglis, took Andy Warhol's Dago colors and combined them with Pollock's Pouring and Dripping. This one is called Bounce from 1969. I suppose there's a little bounce in it, being made of latex dropped on the floor. Let's end with Louise Bourgeois, shown here in a 1982 photograph by Robert Mapplethorpe. She was actually a generation older than the artists she became famous with, and really, when you look at her work, it doesn't quite fit in. She had been around since the 1940s, when she first emerged as a surrealist. I think you can see that with Fillet from 1968. It's process art, kind of, because it's exploring, well, the theme of transformation. But really, that idea of transformation has more to do with surrealist convulsion. Fillet, which means little girl, may look male at first, but closer study complicates that view. Keep looking at it, and you'll see that every part that you might have thought looked male could be female too. The brutality of the piece reflects Bourgeois' scars from sexual abuse as a child. So even in terms of the unconscious, it's surrealist. If there's one surrealist artist she owed a debt to, it's Hans Bellmer, who made those strange and disturbing dolls in the 30s.